2. "I'm here, Hilary," she said. He swung round, smiled at her, took her case in his left hand and seized her right hand in a grasp that made her wince. Yet she returned the grip and gave him the very sweetest smile she could possibly conjure up. Nadine and Hilary had little in common, and they were, in addition, slightly scared of each other. Hilary, a bachelor country parson, was not lacking in that courage which distinguished all the Elliots, but he was definitely scared of 3 things: women of the type of Nadine, whom he described to himself as women of the world, the percolation of luxury into his personal life, and pride. Nadine shied like a startled thoroughbred from that something in Hilary, she did not quite know what, which seemed always to challenge her to some action that she did not want to take. "It's so sweet of you to meet me, Hilary," she said. "I had to," said Hilary, with his usual devastating truthfulness. "The village taxi has broken down again, and mine was the only car available." "I'm afraid I am a great nuisance taking up your time like this," murmured Nadine, as they left the station and approached the battered old Ford. "Not at all," said Hilary cheerfully. "I had to come into the bank anyhow. Get in, will you? The self-starter is out of order. I'll have to wind her up. How's George?" "Not too bad," said Nadine. "He's never been the same since that lung wound, you know. He's wretched always with his miserable asthma." "Ought to live in the country," said Hilary, levering the handle. "He has this War Office appointment," said Nadine, mentally thanking God for it. How she would hate to live permanently in the country. "Ought to leave the army now," said Hilary. "He's getting on. We're all getting on. Especially my old Ford. There, she's off." The Ford coughed twice, bounced spasmodically, and stopped again just as Hilary settled himself in the driver's seat. He gave no exclamation of impatience. He just smiled, got out, and wound her up again. At the 3rd trial they were really off. "Wonderful old car," said Hilary with a deep affection. 13 years old and still serviceable. Don't know what I'd do if I hadn't got her. Mine's a scattered parish, you know. I'd never get through all the visiting without her." Hilary had been badly wounded and gassed as a chaplain in the First World War, and had permanently impaired health and a permanently lamed and painful leg. Because of this, he had been appointed to a small country parish, and had now been vicar of Fairhaven for 27 years. He was 66 years old, the eldest of Lucilla Elliott's 5 children, and so the nominal head of the Elliott family. But only nominal. It was Lucilla who ruled. In looks, all the Elliots were either very beautiful or very plain, according as they took after grandmother or grandfather Elliott. There were no half measures. They were either one thing or the other. Hilary was the other. He was bald and stout, and looked already an old man, yet he had the Elliott charm, inherited from Lucilla, a complete lack of affectation, a simplicity that was wholly disarming and yet a little misleading, because it was combined with considerable astuteness. Nadine was always uncomfortably aware that Hilary's kind brown eyes saw a very great deal more than most people realised, and he had, too, a charm that was all his own, an indefinable air of aristocracy that was the outcome of his own secret spiritual victories. In Hilary, that something in a man that is independent of inheritance, training or tradition, though it has its roots in them, like a plant in the soil, had grown to unusual height and strength. No one took much notice of Hilary when they first met him, but they found that he grew upon them. Fairhaven had no station, and, being of a conservative turn of mind, hoped it never would, and very few shops. Visitors had to be met, and anything very ambitious in the way of purchase had to be made at Radford, down whose main street Hilary's Ford was now chugging. It was a second-rate, modern, sea-coast town of which Fairhaven, boasting ancient history, always expected the worst. "They're putting up a holiday camp here now," said Hilary. "One would expect that," said Nadine. But they both spoke placidly, for 4 good, lengthy English miles divided Radford and Fairhaven, and the one and only good thing to be said about this lean post-war period was that its shortages put a brake upon so-called progress. It would be a very long time before the vulgarity of Radford engulfed Fairhaven. Fairhaven consisted of 2 hamlets, Big Village and Little Village. Big Village, a few miles inland, had one of the loveliest and most ancient churches in all Hampshire, and its cob cottages, with their thatched roofs and whitewashed walls, squatted around it like white chickens around a grey old hen. The whole place, deeply embedded in orchards and gardens and haystacks and cupped in a small, sheltered green valley, was now so much a part of its native earth that it seemed a thing not built upon that earth, but grown out of it, as Little Village had grown out of the mysterious sea marshes that linked the peaceful beauty of the green inland pastures to the terror of the sea. Little Village, consisting of the old house of Dame Rosehay, sheltering behind its wind-twisted oakwood, the shop and coastguard station, the eel and lobster, a few fishermen's cottages, and the harbour, boasted no white and gold gleaming in the sun. Its fuchsias and tamarisk trees clustered about solid walls of grey stone, and the shadows of the wheeling gulls touched the dim blue roofs of slate that were the colour of a sunless sea. Little Village had elbowed its way through the exquisite shifting colours of the marshes, with the knowledge that they could at any time be swept away like a rainbow by the incoming storm of the sea, and had armoured itself accordingly like some crustacean of the deep. It was a matter of temperament, which of the two hamlets one considered the more beautiful. Adventurous hearts preferred Little Village, and of these was Nadine. She was a little surprised at her own preference, for she was no country lover, and Big Village possessed more of the amenities of civilization than Little Village. But there was something about Little Village and the marshes that allied itself with what was best in one and resolved confusions. She seldom paid a visit to Dame Rosehay without going away again, strengthened and subtly changed. As they chugged along the main road, she watched eagerly for the narrow, rutted lane that led down to the marshes and gave one's first breath of the sea. "How's grandmother?" she asked. 86 years old, said Hilary. "Not failing?" she asked anxiously. Grandmother was to the Elliot family what the hub of a wheel is to the spokes. She kept them together. She was the heart of Dame Rosehay. In a sense, she was Dame Rosehay. None of her children or grandchildren dared to think what life would be without her. "Not in herself," said Hilary cheerfully. "Mentally and spiritually, she's alert as ever she was. We're all tied to her apron strings more firmly than ever, I think. But physically, she's very tired. And she misses Ellen." Ellen, grandmother's maid, who had been with her since her marriage, had died suddenly just before the war. "Poor grandmother," said Nadine. "Losing Ellen must have been like losing an arm or a leg." "Worse," said Hilary briefly. The car swung to the right into the rutted lane, and the cool tang of the sea came to meet them. They were silent while Nadine watched for what to returning Elliots was the first sign of home. The two cornfields that marked the place where the lane swung east towards Little Village. The cultivated one upon the landward side of the lane, and the wild one in the marsh that had sprung up year by year ever since a grain ship had been wrecked there, bearing a strange stunted harvest that could not be reaped, but only reverence for the mystery of renewal. The real cornfield was being harrowed, and Hilary drove slowly that Nadine might feast her eyes upon the sight of the two old horses passing back and forth with a cloud of gleaming gulls following after. "Lovely," murmured Nadine. "One of the best sights in the world," said Hilary. "Remember how the children used to hang over the gate to watch?" "It always seems a little odd," she said, "to come home to Dame Rosehay and not be welcomed by the children." In the pre-war days, when Nadine had been separated from George and had been managing an antique furniture shop in London, and her 3 elder children, Ben, Tommy and Caroline, had lived with grandmother at Dame Rosehay, it had been their habit to await the advent of especially beloved visitors at the corner between the cornfields. It was odd not to see Ben's and Tommy's dark heads and Caroline's sunbonnet bobbing about in the sun. "Odd and wrong," said Hilary decidedly. "Children ought to live in the country." "Ben and Tommy and Caroline are at school in the country for most of the year," said Nadine tartly. "And they thoroughly enjoy the contrast of the London holidays." "And the twins?" asked Hilary. "The twins go to a little nursery school in Chelsea," said Nadine. "If they didn't, they'd kill me. In the country there are no nursery schools." "There are other things," said Hilary. "I am told that in the country the mortality among mothers is less high than in towns. You can turn children loose in the country." "You have no experience," Nadine informed him, "of what happens when the twins are turned loose." She looked at her brother-in-law suspiciously. Who had put it into his head that the country life was better for mothers as well as for children? Grandmother? If Grandmother had got it into her head that she and George and the children must all come and live in the country, then she was not going to enjoy her forthcoming visit. "You'll be glad of a cup of tea," said Hilary, sensing agitation in her. It was the chief thing that he knew about women, that they could always be calmed down by the fact, or even the prospect, of a cup of tea. But the beauty of the marshes, even more than the prospect of tea, was already calming Nadine. They had laid aside all terror today, and their mystery was that of beauty only. It was that moment of approaching sunset when the flaming patches of gorse, the wild marsh flowers and sea grasses, the crimson, peaty earth, the creeks and gullies of blue water were yielding to the last demands of the sun all that they possessed of glory. The line of the distant sea was jade green, the sky turquoise, the old castle built upon a tongue of land jutting out into the estuary to the east had parted with its usual sombreness and gathered an amber warmth into its old stones. Beyond the estuary, the white cliffs of the island had lost the dark, chalky look that had been theirs when the sun was high and seemed fashioned all of pearl. And now they were in the little village, with the glinting harbour to the right of them, the cottages among the fuchsias and tamarisks to the left, and before them the old oak wood that protected Dame Rosehay, with the broken gate leading into it. "Is anybody ever going to mend that gate?" asked Nadine. "I shouldn't think so," said Hilary. "It always has been like that." "If that isn't Dame Rosehay all over," said Nadine. But she spoke more in pleasure than exasperation. It was because Dame Rosehay did not change that in this chaotic, tumbling, terrifying world it was a place of such comfort. The moss grew thickly on the drive, and on the lichened boughs of the old gnarled oak trees the new coral-tipped young leaves were burning like candles. It was strange, thought Nadine, that creatures so gloriously fresh and young as those bright leaves could draw their life from anything so old and twisted as those oak trees. It gave one hope. About the twisted roots of the trees a few late narcissus held up their white stars, most proudly in the grass, and to the left of the drive the beautiful wrought-iron gateway that pierced the high red brick garden wall gave her a glimpse of heavenly colour. Flame-coloured tulips, forget-me-nots, deep red wallflowers and golden broom. The scent of the flowers came over the wall in great gusts of perfume, and somewhere in the unseen garden a blackbird was singing in the ilex tree. Hilary's Ford gave a final bounce, collided with the mounting block beside the front door and rocked to a standstill. Hilary drove abominably, and yet he never had a real accident like so many expert drivers. The house of Dame Rosehay boasted a porch, added in the 18th century to the much older building, with a room built on top of it looking out towards the marshes. The porch was in itself like a little room, with benches upon each side and small windows framed in honeysuckle. It was the delight of every child who came to the house. The front door was of beautiful old mahogany, with a brass knocker and slit to the letterbox, and a big brass door handle. Hilary turned the handle, and they went into the dim, stone-flagged panelled hall, with the beautiful old staircase curving away into the dimness. Everything was just as it always was, with the old carved oak chest in its accustomed place, with a bowl of glowing tulips set upon it, the dog's leads hanging from their accustomed hook, set incongruously beneath the beautiful French mirror on the wall. And the smell of Dame Rosehay was just the same. The mingled scent of wood smoke, flowers, furniture polish, dogs and oil lamps. The Elliots were always going to install electric light, but somehow they never did. Something always seemed to happen to prevent them, such as a world war, or the absorption of available funds by the country drainage system, which always required to have a lot of money spent on it, but yet somehow was never really satisfactory. Besides, the Elliots rather liked the soft light and the soft smell of oil, and were loath to part with them, with the exception of Margaret, grandmother's daughter, who did the lamps. "Here's the bastard," said Hilary, as a curious mass of grey fur, like an animated hearthrug, came scurrying from the shadows with frantic yappings and barkings of delight, cast itself at Nadine's feet, and slobbered ecstatically over her shoes. Nadine sighed patiently, for her shoes were new. Also, she disliked displays of emotion, and could never feel for the bastard that intense affection that was felt by other members of the family. The bastard was of a great age, 17 years old, and had lived at Dame Rosehay all his life. He was an institution. No one knew what he was, but he was more like a sheepdog than anything else. He had become, in old age, immensely fat, and found it difficult sometimes to get his breath. He was also rather blind, but he still liked being alive, and Margaret spent hours brushing him, washing him, scenting him with delicate violet powder, dosing him and cooking his special food, staving off by every means in her power that desperate day when he wouldn't like mortal life any more, and they would have, in mercy, to take it from him. But that day was some way off yet, for the mainspring of the bastard's existence was a passionate devotion to the Elliot family, and he found his joy in life in the expression of it, so that he did not much mind his aches and pains, or the indignity of his obesity. It was otherwise with the Chow Pooh Bah, to whom the maintenance of personal dignity and the preservation of personal beauty were of prime importance. In this he was like Nadine, and they had always got on very well together. It was with real respect and liking that Nadine, having perfunctorily patted the bastard, withdrew her feet from beneath his crushing weight and held out her hand to the dignified figure of the Chinese aristocrat, who was pacing to meet her with cordial but critical appreciation of her merits writ large upon his noble countenance. He too was old, though not so old as the bastard, and the fur on his nose and the tip of his beautiful tail was white, but he still kept his graceful, regal figure, and the rest of his coat was still the colour of a ripe cornfield with the sun on it. He inclined his splendid head slightly to receive her respectful caress, as a king would graciously extend a hand to be kissed, and then led the way with dignity towards the drawing-room door, ushering them as a seneschal would do in the presence of the Queen.